Welcome back, everybody. In today's class, we are going to be talking about a new area of development. In particular, we're going to be looking at the branch of cognitive development. Now, this transition to cognitive development is going to get us away from the lectures that we've been having previously on physical development. We are going to be mentioning some physiological things that happen that can increase or impact cognitive development across the variety of areas that we're going to be discussing. But in today's class, we are going to be intentionally transitioning from those biological processes that we spent the last few classes discussing into a new branch. It's our second of three branches that we're going to be talking about. If you don't remember all the details about the three and all the different things we're going to be discussing, you can go back to the very first lecture. But in today's class, again, we are moving to this new area of development that we're going to be discussing for the next few classes called cognitive-based lifespan development. When we look at this idea of cognitive development, one of the first things we want to do is understand what we mean by cognitive. Because the idea of cognition, processing of the mind, makes sense on the surface, but to really get down to the basic details of what cognitive development is all about, we have to first define cognitive psychology. So in terms of a good definition of cognitive psychology, which you see listed up there, it's one of the best ones I've ever come across. The scientific study of thought and processes of the mind. Now that seems fairly simple, but in reality, when we talk about thought and processes of the mind, what we can see is that is a very, very broad area to study. So cognitive psychology can involve things like how we make sense of what's going on in our environment, in essence information processing, but it can also indicate or be related to the process of learning. So how we take things from our environment and choose what to select, how we're going to use that information to kind of change our behavior or understanding in the future. It also involves planning, kind of the decision of what we're going to do based on what we've processed and what we've learned. It involves metacognition, or thinking about our thinking and how that happens. Attention in terms of what we're drawn to, memory in terms of what's in there, intelligence and creativity in terms of how we're able to use what we have, and lastly, it can also involve the area of language. And we are going to be talking about every single one of these areas throughout this cognitive development section. But in today's class, we're going to narrow in on one specific topic, something that's fairly unique. And that's because when we look at cognitive development, when there's so many different things that we can study, one of the questions that people often ask was, where do we start? Who or what do we go to as our first step in cognitive development? Fortunately for us, when we look at cognitive development, many people have kind of settled on the same person or the same idea when discussing this area and really getting a person introduced to this new area of cognitive development. And that first person we start with is quite possibly one of the most influential psychologists of all times, and definitely, at least according to most people, the most influential developmental psychologist. And that was a man named Jean Piaget, who was a very, very famous French psychologist. After creating really one of the most groundbreaking ideas in developmental psychology and the framework for how people can study this idea of cognitive development, even after he stopped his very long career in this field. He actually lived over 80 years, a very long time, and it was able to do a lot of really profound things within the field in those over 80 years of life. When we look at Piaget, though, one of the things we first have to recognize is the fact that when he started off, there was no idea of cognitive development out there. There was no research that was being done in that particular area. In fact, his early years of work were being, I guess, conducted with another famous researcher we'll talk about later named Alfred Binet. Binet was in charge of creating the first intelligence test, and we'll talk about why he did all those things, some of the important contributions he had to the field in that process. But one of the people that he hired to help him do these intelligence tests, to run these comparisons, was Jean Piaget. And when Piaget started off in his research, he operated under the assumption that many people did at the time, and that was the fact that when we look at kids, What we saw was people that thought like adults, acted like adults, that just didn't have a lot of information. In essence, kids were the same as adults, just really stupid. They didn't know enough information, and therefore their intelligence was lower, and they didn't perform as well in different situations. So the philosophy at the time was just keep plugging kids with more and more information, and by the time they're done, they'll think like adults. They'll be able to process the world with the same level of knowledge as everybody else. Well, Piaget operated under that assumption when he worked with Alfred Binet, and in particular with children that he wanted to come up with different intelligence tests on. And when he used that assumption, what he quickly came to realize was that it didn't really work very well. When he studied intelligence in kids and tried to compare them across different ages, it wasn't that some children just didn't have enough information. It was as if the children were seeing the world in a completely different way. It was as if they didn't even think of things working the same way adults thought of them working as. And when he found this out, when he came to this discovery, he was really enamored with this notion that maybe we don't just see people lacking information when we look at kids. Instead, we might see people that actually see the world in a completely different light. And it's not until they change, until they develop cognitively, that they start to think like adults. And when he decided to study this, he grabbed three of his most accessible test subjects he could ever find, his three children, Laurent, Lucienne, and Jacqueline. You see those three pictured in the right-hand corner of this slide, and started studying them extensively for many, many years so he could form the framework for this new endeavor that he created called cognitive development research. And a lot of the terminology and concepts that he used really shaped the field of cognitive development that we're going to be talking about in the next few classes. Now, when we look at the general gist of what Piaget found from his studies, what we can argue is that his research really changed our way of thinking in two major fronts. The first big thing he argued, which was really groundbreaking at the time, was that not only did children think differently from adults, but their passage through this developmental process happened in a very consistent way. In particular, he argued that we could, based on the child's age and where they were, kind of predict exactly where they would be in this developmental process, where their cognitions would be kind of focused on, and which challenges they would be going through. And when he looked at this idea of development, the other thing that made him really groundbreaking was his notion that when we look at cognitive development, it's not something that's just kind of happening magically. It's happening to children as a result of kind of their need to adapt to what they're encountering. He argues when a child's in a very simple environment with not a lot of challenges, not a lot of issues, there's no need for cognitive change. But as a child grows up, encounters new things, new demands are put on him or her, the child has to adapt. The child has to change his or her way of thinking, come up with a new understanding of the world, and that unfolding process is really at the root of cognitive development. But how they accomplish this is just as interesting as the general theory that he presented in the first place. When we talk about this idea of development, the notion of development is really embedded in this concept or this term that he introduced called a schema. He said when you look at children, when you look at adults, what you see is individuals with all of these different rules or frameworks for how the world around them works. Gravity would be a schema, the differences between genders is a schema, the general idea of what a hand is a schema. He said essentially, when we look at people understanding the world, the way they process it, the way they make sense of it, is by coming up with really good schemas. And by having a good schema, you can predict exactly what's going to happen in the world around you, and theoretically, because of that, interact with the world much more successfully. And he argued that when we look at kids, what we see are these tiny little schema creators, people that are just trying to come up with rule after rule after rule of how the world around them works. And what they do once they form a schema is essentially test it out. So a child might form a schema of gravity and look desperately around them to figure out if their schema of gravity actually matches what they see in the environment. environment. Now, what Piaget argued happens here is that once a child forms a schema and they find something that matches that schema, they can get into a cognitive state of mind called equilibrium, when there's perfect harmony between this new schema that they formed and what they see in their environment. So if a child thinks that gravity works in a specific way and they encounter something that supports that idea, he said the child would be content and the child would think this schema works, I'm in equilibrium, so I don't need to do anything. But he said eventually what will happen with most schemas in children, because very, very often schemas are imperfect to begin with, is they'll encounter a situation where the evidence or the event doesn't match up with the schema that they have. So maybe a child starts to think that the dad always has to come home at a certain time. And after months and months of having dad come home at a certain time, he comes home at a different time. He changes something up. And the child has to quickly, they argued, Piaget argued, the child has quickly become part of, has gotten into, let me change that, a state of mind called disequilibrium. And once the child's in that state of mind called disequilibrium, Piaget argued that he or she has to quickly adjust to that, has to change something so they can get back in a state of equilibrium. And he argued that children have two choices for how they might go about doing that. The first option they have is something that he called assimilation, where they find a way to kind of keep their schema, not change a single thing about it, but still explain away what they saw. So maybe they remember the event differently, or maybe they kind of come up with some weird exception that makes that particular thing okay, but still continue to keep that exact schema that they had in the first place. And if they are keeping their schema, again, this is something that we call assimilation. But what Piaget thought was exceptionally important in cognitive development was the moments when a child didn't keep his or her schema, when they did something called accommodation, when they adapted to this new environment, to this new information, and started to try to see the world with new rules that made a little bit more sense. And he said, in essence, that this adaptation process, this growth from infants to adulthood, was only possible by the process of accommodation, by coming up with new schemas that fit the situation better and allowed a child to be in equilibrium again. He actually called that process of returning to equilibrium through accommodation equilibration. It's, I know, a weird term, but it was that way of kind of making sense of things by adjusting schemas and tweaking. And he argued that accommodation did not happen that often. Very often we would just assimilate when we found things that didn't agree with our environment because it was much easier to do that. But for a child to truly think of adult, what they would need to do is constantly accommodate their schemas to new ideas, to new scenes, and in doing so over the years, have schemas that matched up with most adults. And it was a difficult process. It was something that took a lot of time, but eventually could be achieved by all. At least that was the framework of his theories, that all of us would eventually accommodate our schemas to get to a point where we thought just like adults. Now, when we look more at Piaget's theory, what we see was there was much more complexity to it that really made it as famous as it was. The first thing that's really important when we talk about Piaget's ideas was the fact that when we talk about schemas with kids, we weren't looking at disparate things. In essence, he argued that usually with kids, each one of them was dealing with the same big scale schemas at the exact same time, and that these big scale schemas could actually be described in what he called stages of development. So a child was trying to figure out, who he was, trying to figure out, social roles, moral standards, all of these struggles were kind of universal with all children at about the same age. So he would describe that as a specific stage in cognitive development, where those were the prominent schemas that the child was trying to master. The idea was that at about the same time, Not only did children start to deal with these conflicts, these kind of moments where there is disequilibrium, but they also often try to kind of come to a resolution to these conflicts at about the same age. And after multiple exposures of issues that kind of raise these conflicts that they're dealing with over and over again, they come to a resolution and are able to move to the next stage of cognitive development. And in Piaget's mind, all children went through, at least all normal children with normal cognitive functioning, went through the same exact development process, went through the exact same stages and the exact same issues at similar ages. And these stages he actually went on to define. So Piaget argued that the first 2 years of your life involves something that he called the sensory motor stage. We're going to detail all the specifics of the sensory motor stage here in a few minutes, but know that this was his first stage of cognitive development that he highlighted, and he thought that this was a big stage that kind of set the framework for how cognitive development was going to occur for us throughout our entire life. He then argued that the next stage of cognitive development was the pre-operational stage, and we'll get detail this a little bit later. It lasted from 2 to 7 years of age. We progressed to the concrete operational stage from 7 to 11. And finally, we got into the formal operational stage where we dealt with a set of schemas from very abstract to idealistic things that could allow us to eventually, by the time we got through this last stage, start to think like adults. And again, in each of these stages, he argued that there were many different things that we were dealing with, different schemas that we were having to generate, so we could progress to the next stage and think more and more like adults. And all of these stages were invented by Piaget, or at least he described them, and many of them we still kind of recognize today as the frameworks for how cognitive development might work, even though we'll discuss later some of the issues that people had with these. But first, let's break down each of these different stages.
If we focus in on Piaget's first stage of development that he detailed, the sensory motor stage, we can see how even these specific stages of development, according to Piaget, can be broken down even further. When we look at the sensory motor stage, what we see is a process that lasts from birth to about 2 years of age, or 24 months. But within that development, children are going through these schema changes and these learning processes all throughout that sensory motor stage. And the first part of this particular stage of development, according to Piaget, children were focused on simple reflexes, kind of getting coordination of their reflex systems together. And that lasted, according to him, for about 1 month. And this is where children really focus on the reflexes and start to try to even understand the purpose of their reflexes. After that, in the sensory motor stage, Piaget contended that children start working on their first specific behaviors. So they not only start to focus on their reflexes, but they start looking for kind of responses to things that are going on in their environment. So they take joy from things. They start to kind of realize that those behaviors, those responses, are giving them pleasure, are giving them their needs, and that usually entices them, according to Piaget, to start using those habits, using those behaviors more often, even when they're not typically a reflex. And that's why he called these primary circular reactions, the very first reactions to the recognition that something can be desirable. After about 4 months within the sensory motor stage, he argued that children went through something called secondary circular reactions, where they started not only recognizing that specific behaviors could elicit positive things, but specific objects could actually bring pleasure compared to other ones. And this is a stage where children start to find ways to get those objects that bring pleasure to them. So if you see a young child in this stage, according to Piaget, what they're going through is this recognition that not only does a rattle provide pleasure, but if I do something like coo or cry when something's not present, I might actually be able to entice whatever's going on in my environment to cause that object to appear. And that recognition that behavior can instigate the presence of specific objects, and that specific objects in theory, can provide pleasure and also displeasure, is the big thing that kids are going through, that big schema change that they're learning at this particular stage. Once they start to actually grow, they start to realize that not only can they recognize objects that are pleasurable, but they can actually interact with these objects, and that they can actually move to grab them, they can approach them, and they can try to find ways not only to look at things or suck on things, but they can find ways to get things into their mouth or touch things and approach them by crawling at them. And this happens when we see this something called a coordination of secondary reactions, which is in about 8 months to a year of age. After that, we move to tertiary circular reactions, where children start to realize that not only are things pleasurable just on their own with basic functioning, so a ball can be rolled and it's enjoyable, but you can do a lot of things with that ball. You can bounce it, you can slam it on the ground. Same thing with food. You can not only eat it, but you can throw it. This is a problem a lot of parents face with 1-year-olds, is that they learn that food can have many properties that make it enjoyable. And this recognition of the multiple purposes of something is the major schema change at this particular stage. Afterwards, when a child starts to kind of move on to the end of the sensory motor stage, we see them learning how to symbolize things, how to represent things. So not only do they cry when they want something, but they can actually signify what it is they actually want. So sometimes you might see children at this particular stage use one word to define what it is that they actually want, or have a specific cry or point to what they're looking for in order to get that object that they're trying to approach. And when there's something bad, they learn how to signify that they don't want that particular object. And all of this learning process, according to Piaget, involves the sensory motor stage, or is involved within the sensory motor stage, but it requires different forms of schema changes, different types of reequilibration for these children as they're kind of running into different problems and running into different things that they experience within their environment. The reason why it's under the umbrella of the sensory motor stage is because when we look at the sensory motor stage, we see a real occupation and a kind of a focus on objects and basic behaviors. Essentially, learning how our senses work, learning how our motor system works, is the primary goal of children during this particular stage. As we develop, we move on to new focuses and new areas of cognitive development. In particular, when we look at the sensory motor stage, though, what we can often see is that there's two really recognizable things that kind of signify the sensory motor stage. So not only do kids go through specific stages, they learn two big cognitive theories in this particular stage. One of the theories that they learn is something called object permanence, and that's this notion that when things aren't seen or when things aren't heard, they still exist. One classic test you can do with children on this is to show them an object and then cover it with something. And when you have a young child, if they have a desirable object in front of them and they see it, they might grab at it. But the first second you cover it and they don't have object permanence, they'll stop reaching for it. They'll stop thinking that that particular object actually exists. But once they recognize this concept of object permanence, they typically start to try to reach around whatever's blocking them. And this can be carried over to a lot of things. So if you think about playing peekaboo with a child, before they have object permanence, understand that one of the reasons why they think this game is so exciting is because they think you're actually disappearing when they're covering their eyes. If they can't see you, you're not there. And that kind of experience, I'm sure you could realize, is very trippy for kids, not recognizing when everything will come and go from existence is a very interesting experience for them. Another big thing that kids get is a sense of self. So this recognition that they are a separate entity, that the world around them is kind of moving and adjusting, and that they are indeed interacting with the world. The world's not just kind of moving around with them. So they have to recognize that they are a unique individual, that they can see themselves in mirrors, and that they can recognize who they actually are. In addition to kind of mastering those sensory behaviors, mastering those physical movements so they can get at what they want, recognizing that they are an entity that has to move throughout the world, that has to kind of interact with things, is the other big thing that's related to the sensory motor stage. But after the sensory motor stage, we move on to some new development. In particular, the next stage we move on to is something called the pre-operational stage. And the pre-operational stage can once again be broken down into two subcategories, but both of them operate on this recognizing that, or operate on this process of recognizing that we can represent things with words and images. So when kids get into this stage, not only do they recognize that objects can have meaning, but they can actually have symbolic meaning as well. So when we drink tea with young children, before the age of 2, all they can recognize is that they're drinking tea. When you get to a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old, they can start to recognize that they can pretend to drink tea. Now, sometimes it's very difficult for them to kind of disconnect reality from what they're pretending. In fact, that's the major thing that they have to learn in this particular process, that something can represent something even if it's not actually going on. But this kind of transition from just understanding things in very concrete logic to understanding things as being, ideal, or, well, not ideal, but fake, or I guess pretend, is a big transition that kids have to understand. They can also pick up on things like even lying at this particular point in time. But as they go through this particular stage, we can break it down into two categories. The first category is called the symbolic function stage, where this idea of pretend is very, very important. This kind of recognizing that there's differences between what's going on and what they can pretend is going on. And this involves this concept of pretend play. So those two girls over to the right are drinking tea, and the younger child, because she's less than the age of 2, might be very confused and befuddled because she doesn't quite understand what's going on. She's got a cupcake in her hand, but when she tries to eat it, it's not edible. So it's probably very frustrating because she doesn't quite get how that can represent a cupcake if she can't eat it. And she's seeing tea being poured, but she's not actually getting any. So this is a very confusing game to the girl on the right. But the one on the left, because she's in this symbolic function stage, can start to understand how you can pretend with this game. And that kind of difference between these girls is fairly easily recognizable when you interact with them. Another big thing that the kids have to get through in this symbolic function stage is this concept of egocentrism, recognizing that what they know, what they experience, is not the same as what everybody else knows and everybody else experiences. So when you see a young girl or boy at the age of about 3, and you talk to them about their day, they might be very confused as to why you need to talk to them about their day, because they anticipate that you know everything that they know. Or then they talk to you about something, they might tell you about a specific boy that they know and just use his or her name, I guess his name if we're talking about a boy, his name in passing, as if you should know who he is, even if you've never met him, because in their mind, if they know it, you should know it. And if they don't know it, you shouldn't know it as well. So one classic experiment that's often done with kids to really show how pronounced this egocentrism is when teachers or experimenters will slide something into, say, a box of crayons. So they might slide a bunch of markers into a box of crayons. They'll ask kids what's in the box without letting them see what's in the box. And the kids will inevitably say crayons because it's a crayon box and they know what a crayon box is. When they ask them then what you would think the neighbor would think is in that box, or what another child would think in the box, they'd once again say crayons. And then when you open that box, show them that there's markers in the box instead of crayons, those kids will get the joke. They'll enjoy it at this particular stage. But then when you close it again and ask them what do they think the neighbor's going to think is in there before they see in there, they'll still say, well, actually they'll change their answer now to markers, because they think that they know that there's markers in there. They recognize that there's markers in there. So they think that everybody else will also know that there's markers in there. And this deals with this concept of egocentrism, not recognizing that other people have different perspectives and different experiences from them. One last thing that kids have to get through at this particular stage is this understanding of something called animism. And this is actually something that usually drags out a little bit longer than the age of 4. But this is when they first start understanding the concept that inanimate objects don't actually move, don't actually interact with us. So you can see the young boy in this picture below probably displaying a lack of understanding of animism. That it looks like he's almost afraid of this snowman actually coming and attacking him. Because for children at this stage, they don't recognize that those things can't happen. That these kind of theoretical ideas of maybe the sidewalk jumping up and tripping them, or a snowman coming to life and attacking them, isn't probable, or is probably not going to happen. And until they get through this stage of development, and usually even a little bit further into life, they don't quite understand how that actually works. Another big substage that they go through during this preoperational stage is something called the intuitive thought substage. And this is when kids start becoming extremely cerebral. So they start to learn things like symbolism. So you can not only pour tea with pretend tea things, but you can even pretend that you have a teapot with something else in this particular stage. And children really start to play with kind of the hypothetical and pretend. And when you get into this stage, you get a lot of interesting behaviors that start to emerge. So lots of pretend play becomes even imaginary. They love to play different types of games where you're acting out specific roles, and that's because they start to understand that not only can something represent another thing without actually being that, but you can have just random things and random behaviors that don't have to fit in the context of anything. Another cognitive growth within this particular stage involves understanding why and how things are connected. So if any of you have ever seen young children between the ages of 4 to 7, you probably already know that one of the big things that they're doing in this particular stage is asking why for everything. And this why question is actually helping them through another schema change where they're understanding both grammar and how things actually are connected by trying to find explanations for some of the more basic questions that they ask, or the more basic things that we look at in our environment. And by constantly asking why, through about 2 to 3 years, these kids can really grow in their vocabulary and their understanding of how things work in the world. So it's another major schema shift area within the preoperational stage. After the preoperational stage, after kids reach about 7 years of age, kids move on to another schema transition area called the concrete operational stage. And in this particular stage, kids are really focused on doing cognitive transformations or cognitive transitions within their schemas. One of the big things they actually start to do at this point in time is do operations, which are kind of reversing and transitioning of pieces of information. So if I said, if I placed 10 pennies in front of you and took away 5 of those pennies and asked you how many pennies you'd have left, well, a kid starting this stage would have to count 5 pennies. The thing that's interesting with these kids, though, is if I took those same 5 pennies and I put them back and asked how many pennies you have now, these kids would have to count all 10 pennies again. As kids progress through this stage, as they get to ages 10 or 11, what you see is that they can actually understand that you're not really changing anything when you put those 5 pennies back. So they might still have to count the 5 pennies after you take 5 away from 10, but when you put those first 5 back, they know that there's 10 pennies there. They know that nothing has changed, so the answer that started out the equation is the answer that finishes the equation. So learning how to do operations, learning how to transition things in their head is a big step within this particular stage. Another thing that kids start to do is learn things like conservation and analogies. Conservation involves this notion that when something transfers from one kind of product to another, nothing is actually lost. So a classic example of this with kids is taking 2 glasses of water that are equal to each other and pouring the liquid within one glass into another glass that's a different shape. And that transition of one glass to a different shaped glass changes the kid's perspective of how much is actually in that glass, even though they see you pouring the water from one glass to another. Another great example of this, one that you often see with kids at about the age of 7 or 8, is when you give them a pizza. So if you give a child a pizza, put it in front of them, and cut it into 4 pieces, they might start crying and whining because they want more than 4 pieces of pizza. But if you take that exact same pizza in front of them then, and then cut that pizza into an extra 4 pieces, so you cut it into 8 pieces, knowing that it's the same pizza, having them see you make that cut will be enough to trigger these kids into being upset with you again, because now there's too many pieces of pizza that they have to eat. Obviously, it's the exact same amount. We know this because we can do these conservation techniques, but for kids trying to understand this, this is a process that's very tough for them to do. Analogies is more of a cognitive thing that they have to process, so not only understanding things in their environment, but also understanding kind of the symbolism and the idea behind how words can be connected is another challenge, another schema change that kids have to go through. So if I gave you the analogy, run is to walk, as fast as is to slow, heart, or run, you probably know the answer to that. And as we test kids during this stage, they actually gradually become more and more aware as to how these analogies work and can, most of the time, be correct in these analogies as they progress throughout this particular stage. And the last big thing that happens in this particular stage, the last schema development thing that's really, really critical for kids at this age, is the ability to do something called metacognition. Metacognition is the thinking about thinking. So not only can kids process things at this stage, but they start to realize what their thoughts actually are. They start to pick up on those voices in their head and realize when they're thinking incorrectly or why they're doing something, instead of just kind of reacting to things within their environment. And when a child recognizes that they can think about how they're thinking, you get a big shift into some very dramatic thought processes. So this is the last schema-driven change that kids go through in this concrete operational stage. After the concrete operational stage, kids become much, much more complex. In fact, for Piaget, he argued that this is the last stage of transitioning in schemas. And when we get here, what we often do is start to become much more abstract in the way we think. So we understand that we can think about thinking, we understand that we can do transitions and make sense of things. So now we have to focus on more complex ideas. And in particular, when we get into this adolescent stage, we start to focus on ideals. So what might happen, how could things actually play out? So not only can kids pretend, but they can make believe as to how a situation might actually end up. Before this stage, kids don't really have the ability to foresee what might happen. They just react to something the way they've learned how to react and don't really think about the possible outcomes. But as we progress throughout this stage, we recognize this concept of consequences and possible alternatives as to the way things actually come, or way things actually might play out. And that kind of change in our thinking really helps kids in this stage start to be able to think about their futures and think about how things can actually change due to their actions. They also really start to master those logic problems that we talked about earlier, and they start to really focus in on this deductive reasoning. So if I do this, this should happen. If I do that, this should happen. However, even though they can extend this concept to other individuals, so if Michelle does this, this will happen, and if Bob does this, this will happen, this doesn't happen nearly as much as their own if I do this, and then this will happen theories. And that's because during this stage, even though we're becoming much more capable of understanding complex ideas, we also have a tendency to really focus in on the self. In fact, Piaget argued that kind of transitioning out of this focus of the self is something that happens for some people much later in their development, even though he also contended that some people never really transition from this focus of the self. And he called this focus adolescent egocentrism, this heightened self of self-consciousness, this recognition of everything that's going on within this self, and this kind of tendency to ignore what's going on outside of ourselves. And this is kind of brings up two major thought processes that go on within the child because of this focus on the self. One of the things that adolescents often have, according to Piaget, is this concept of an imaginary audience. This idea that not only do they focus on themselves, but everybody else is focusing on them. Everybody else is paying attention to them. Everybody else is really picking up on every aspect of them. So you might have a child who, obsesses about their clothes and thinks that they can't wear that outfit that they wore 2 weeks ago because somebody might make fun of them for wearing the same outfit 2 times, within the month. Or a child might think that when they're alone watching TV, that somebody is there kind of hovering over them, watching them. And that real kind of focus on everybody looking at them, everybody thinking about them, is something that a lot of people have to kind of get past in this formal operational stage. But Piaget argued that some people never really get past this formal operational stage. Another thing that happens with this adolescent egocentrism is this concept of something called a personal fable. This idea that not only is everybody focusing on us, but that there's something extremely special about us, and there's something within our lives that has this kind of dynamic story to it. So we're either a tragedy or an amazing story, or something that's going on that's worth telling and worth kind of following. So we perceive ourselves as being very unique, and also we perceive ourselves as invincible until this story really plays out. And that concept of the personal fable and this idea that everybody's looking at us typically is what Piaget believes kind of triggers those unsafe behaviors that we talked about earlier. Now, we think it's also a response to kind of a heightened level of emotions. We talked about that when we looked at physical development and the overactivity of the amygdala, the area that's responsible for emotions. But in addition to that, Piaget believed that this perception of ourselves as being unique, that we have this amazing story, also plays a role in that heightened level of kind of dangerous, unsafe behavior that kids often develop. This particular stage of development that Piaget proposed is one that's come under a lot of heat over recent years. One of the reasons why this is the case is because a lot of researchers believe, like Piaget somewhat proposed, that most people never really get through this stage. There's a lot of adults who still think that the world revolves around them, that everybody's kind of paying attention to them, and that they're extremely unique, so they're never going to be hurt. And there's also a lot of people who struggle with understanding very deep logic things, so they can't focus on the future very well. They can't really understand logic that well, and it's because they never really mastered this formal operational stage. Piaget thought most people got through it, but there's a lot of recent cognitive researchers that argue that most people don't actually completely master this particular stage. And if we do master this stage, it might happen at very different times in our lives. So for some people, it might happen in our 20s. Others, it might even happen in our 30s, when we finally maybe have children or move on throughout our life. So even though this stage might happen, and even though we might go through these cognitive changes, there is a lot of debate as to when we actually go through these changes and when we actually accomplish some of the breakthroughs in our schemas that we struggle with in this particular stage.